One of the most ridiculous arguments that is ever made in the post 9/11 era is when we libertarians say, let's look at the motives that drove the terrorists on 9/11. And those who are defenders of the war on terrorism respond, oh, you're blaming America. As if America, in their mind, is the federal government. Because you see that what they're trying to do when they use that tactic is to avoid any focus on what the federal government was doing prior to 9/11. And in their minds, the federal government is everything. While we libertarians draw a distinction between the country and the federal government. So that while it's possible to focus on federal conduct in order to protect the country from what follows from that federal conduct. I saw this phenomenon many years ago in the early days of the Clinton administration. That some of you may recall the Oklahoma City bombing by Timothy McVeigh. And right after that bombing, we libertarians were saying, look, we've got to focus on what was motivating McVeigh. And you had a variation of this blame America concept. They said, oh, you're justifying what he's doing. You're a justifier. Well, of course, the idea was we don't want the American people to be focusing on what the federal government did that motivated this man. Well, you got to focus on motivation. Because by understanding motivation, you may be able to correct the conduct that gives rise to the retaliatory conduct. And that's what we did. We kept raising in people's mind what the federal government had done at Waco. And massacring all of these innocent people, which had caused this anger and rage within this man that ultimately resulted in the killing of those innocent people in Oklahoma City. And what we argued is that by understanding motive, that you can stop the federal government from doing these things that then give rise to these people that ordinarily would just stay quiet in society. And sure enough, there have been since then, we've raised the consciousness of what happened at Waco. There have been no more Waco-like massacres. Oh, and guess what? No more Oklahoma City-type terrorist attacks. So it's vitally important that we don't fall for this, oh, you're blaming America, and oh, you're justifying, and then we examine what the federal government was doing prior to 9/11. Because what they were doing in the Middle East was 100 times worse than what they did at Waco. If you consider, for example, the more than 10 years of sanctions, brutal sanctions, against the Iraqi people, every year, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of Iraqi children were dying as a result of those sanctions. It was almost like a blockade, a total blockade. 2 high UN officials, Hans von Sponeck and Dennis Halliday, resigned in protest to what they called this genocide. When the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Madeleine Albright, now here's the official spokesman for the United States government to the entire world. She's interviewed on 60 Minutes, and 60 Minutes asked her, what's your reaction to 500,000 children having died of these sanctions? This was in '96. The sanctions went on for another 5 years. She didn't deny the number of 500,000. She said, well, it's a tough decision, but yeah, we think it's worth it. I mean, imagine that. I mean, what could be worth the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent children? Well, it was the concept of regime change. They wanted to get rid of Saddam, and they wanted to put their favorite regime in. Because by this time, they had turned against Saddam Hussein after partnering with him throughout the 1980s. How could that not boil over into anger and rage, not only among the parents of these children, but among everybody in the Middle East? They were stationing troops near Mecca and Medina, the holiest lands in the Muslim religion. How could that not have a reaction? Unconditional military and cash, money to the Israeli government, regardless of what they did. So you had this cauldron of anger and rage rising up in the Middle East, It didn't take a rocket scientist to predict what was going to come. We predicted it. If you look at our articles before 9/11, we said, if you don't stop this, you're going to have terrorist attacks on American soil. We weren't the only ones. There's a scholar named Chalmers Johnson that wrote a book called Blowback, where he said the same thing before 9/11. If you don't stop this, you're going to have terrorism on American soil. And they didn't stop it. They just kept doing it and doing it. You had terrorist attacks in 1993 at the World Trade Center. No different from what was going to come 8 years later, except that that one wasn't successful. You had the terrorist attacks on the USS Cole, on the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. And they didn't desist until finally 9/11 comes. And they said, oh, don't look at what we did before. It's just that they hate us for our freedom and values. That's the only reason they're angry, is our freedom and values. You know, rock and roll and Christian churches, and that's why they hate us. Ignore everything we did prior to that time. And they say 9/11 changed the world. It didn't change what they've been doing, because guess what they did? They walked into Iraq with a brutal invasion to accomplish what the sanctions had not accomplished for 11 years. And all those dead children. They just use that as the excuse with this fake and false WMD scare. And then they invade Afghanistan, affecting a regime change operation there too, killing untold numbers of people. I would say 99% of the Afghan people that they've killed had nothing to do with 9/11. How can that not generate anger and hatred? Compare that to how they handled the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center, which was the right way to handle it. Ramzi Youssef, one of the conspirators who attacked the World Trade Center, was in Pakistan hiding out. He escaped from the United States. They waited him out. They didn't invade Pakistan. They didn't bomb any wedding parties. They didn't kill any innocent people. They didn't treat it as a military problem. They treated it as a criminal justice problem. They had Interpol looking for these guys. And sure enough, they find him in Pakistan. They raid his house. They arrest him. They don't assassinate him. They don't kill him. They bring him back to the United States. He stands trial. At his sentencing hearing, he points to the federal government, to U.S. foreign policy, for his rage. And when you read his transcript of his sentencing hearing, you can feel that rage in that man. And he mentions the sanctions and the innocent life lost. Not justifying what is, well, he was justifying what he was doing. We wouldn't justify it, but we have to understand motive. The same way that a prosecutor in a criminal prosecution explains motive to a jury. Not justifying, of course, the guy that he's prosecuting, but making it so that the jury will understand. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important for one thing, just in terms of conscience and morals and what we are as Americans. Is this what we stand for? Invasions and occupations and killing of innocent people. And saying, oh yeah, they're worth it. It's a mathematical calculation. But even more than that, they have used that as the excuse to take away our freedom. You see, because as I've argued so many times, this foreign policy is the greatest terrorist-producing machine in history. The more people they kill, the more anger, the more terrorism. And as long as they've got this perpetual stream of potential terrorists, parents, grooms that have lost their brides in a wedding bombing, people lost their children, then they use that as the excuse to say, we've got to keep you safe. And so we're going to dominate you, we're going to take away your freedoms. And I'm not talking about just the pat-downs at the airport. I'm talking about something much more revolutionary than that, much more gigantic than that. I'm talking about the abandonment of our own heritage of liberty. Do you realize today that we live in a country in which the government has the authority, the power to seize any one of you, anyone in this country, and cart him away to a concentration camp, to a military dungeon, to a prison, with no jury trial, no charges? Just take you and put you there? I mean, I find it fascinating that, like conservatives, always talking about gun rights, which, yeah, important. I totally agree with it. Say, I don't want Obama taking away my guns, but I want him to have the power to come and seize me and cart me away to a concentration camp. And torture me. Because they have the power to torture people now, too. That we live in a country where federal agents can come into your home without you knowing about it and peer into your personal life and your drawers and your closets and see what you're reading and monitor your email and your telephone calls. And even if technically they're required to get a warrant, we all know that Congress is going to give them immunity for it, like they did in the telecom scandal where they admittedly committed illegal acts. In a country where the president can send the entire nation into war. Imagine that. The entire nation in war, one man. No congressional declaration of war, no national debate. He decides, along with his army, his national security state. Indeed, we live in a country where the president can order his forces to assassinate any one of us. We don't have to be overseas to be assassinated because the whole world's a battlefield. I mean, imagine that. We live in a country where the president can order us to be assassinated without any explanation, without showing what his standards are, what his reasoning was. It's incredible. That's the legal revolution that has taken place post 9/11. And I think most everyone would agree that that's not the kind of country that our founding fathers envisioned. It's the kind of country that exists in Egypt, where they have a military dictatorship. In fact, do you know that what the Egyptian people have been protesting ever since Mubarak was in it and they threw him out? You know what their biggest grievance has been? These powers. These powers under which we're now living under the federal government, that's what they've been protesting against. The power to go out and seize Egyptian citizens without a trial, without formal charges, torture them, execute them, and the military dictatorship will not relinquish those powers. Isn't that ironic that we now live in a country where the government has the same powers? And it's not a surprise because the Egyptian government is one of the favorite governments of the U.S. government. Guess who's been funneling billions of dollars of money to the Egyptian government for the last 30 years? They love the Egyptian military regime. They may play this game now of, oh, you guys got to straighten things out, you're taking some Americans into custody. This is nonsense. They have loved this regime. Oh, we see all this born-again fervor against Syria? Oh, Syria dictatorship, brutal dictatorship. Oh, really? What about that guy that you kidnapped at Dulles Airport that was returning home to Canada because he's a Canadian citizen and who you, through the CIA, renditioned, took, and delivered to the Syrian government for the purpose of torture? Who struck that deal? Who negotiated that deal? Did the president sign off or did the CIA do it on its own initiative? They selected the Syrian government precisely because of its brutality, because it was a brutal dictatorship that tortured people very well. These are the kind of things that engender anger and hatred over the double standards, the double dealing, that they then use to take away our freedoms by mimicking the dictatorships that they're supporting overseas. And that's not the way it was supposed to be. You see, when our ancestors called this federal government into existence with the Constitution, and let's not forget that, the people came first. They were operating under the Articles of Confederation, and they weren't too excited about this new federal government. And the reason they weren't too excited about it is because they feared that it was going to become just like King George's government. It was going to become another dictatorship. And they were assured, they were promised, you don't need to worry about that ever happening because this is a government of limited enumerated powers. The power to seize you and cart you away to a dungeon isn't enumerated, then it doesn't have the power to do that. If it's not mentioned in there, they got a power to torture, then forget it. They don't have the power. Here are the powers. Article 1, Section 8. And Americans said, okay. But only on the condition to make everything clear that we get 10 amendments right after that government's brought into existence. To make it real clear that we consider this government a tremendous threat to our freedoms. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion. It's not a Bill of Rights. It's a Bill of Prohibitions. Because our rights don't come from the Constitution. They don't come from the government. They come from God. They come from our humanity. They're inherent in us. And so when you read the First Amendment, it says Congress shall pass no law. Too bad they didn't just stop there, you know. But it's clear that our ancestors were concerned about this. And then they got 4 amendments, 4, dealing with the power of government to seize citizens and do bad things to them. Not just citizens, but anybody. Foreigners too. Because if you look at the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th amendments, they refer to people, persons. And they said you'll never seize a person, deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That term, due process of law, it's part of our moral fiber. It's part of our psyche as Americans. And you know where that term comes from? It stretches all the way back to the year 1215, when the English people were faced with this exact situation that we're faced with. Their king, King John, was seizing people, and prior kings to that were seizing English citizens, carting them away, taking them to the Tower of London, no charges, no due process, no jury trials, torturing them in the Tower of London, putting them on the rack, killing them. And people had accepted that. Until 1215 comes along and the English people said, no more. No more will you ever do this to us again. And in Magna Carta, the king succumbed to that pressure at a point of a sword. And he says, I hereby acknowledge that never again will I wield the power to take your life and your liberty and your property in violation of the law of the land. And law of the land, that's the phrase that eventually evolved into due process of law. It's found in the 5th Amendment. And those four amendments are designed to prevent this kind of thing. Right to counsel. They're all like a barbed wire obstruction against the government doing bad things to people. You know, right to counsel, right to due process of law, trial by jury, right to bail. But you know what they did after 9/11? It's one of the most clever, brilliant tricks that's ever been devised. They said, we're going to convert this crime, terrorism, which everybody agrees is a crime. I mean, nobody can deny that it's a crime. It's in the U.S. Code. It's the reason why there's criminal prosecutions in the federal courts on terrorism every day. I mean, it's a crime. But what they said was that, we're going to call it now an act of war, again, at our option. We can do either one. We can treat him as an enemy combatant, which means no constitution, no rights, no protections, or we can go the criminal defendant route. And there's a guy named Jose Padilla that was their test case for this, where Padilla was started out in the federal court system. They took him to a military dungeon. They tortured him. Looks like they permanently damaged his mind. And then they, right after they received a favorable ruling from the Federal Court of Appeals, before the Supreme Court could affect that ruling, they reconverted him back to a federal court defendant after torturing him for 3 years without a trial. He's an American. What they did to Padilla, and that's the significance of the Padilla case, they can do now to every single person in this room. That's the kind of country we live in. All right, so what can we do about this? Well, the first thing we got to decide is this consistent with a free society? Is this what a constitutional republic's all about? And you all know that we libertarians have arrived at the answer to those questions. This is not a free society. And so we have to defend these rights and these freedoms. But we go further. You know, people say, Jacob, you know, they got to keep you safe. They forget about keeping me safe. You know, I don't want to give up my freedom for safety. If I got to take my chances at the hand of some terrorist, fine. At least I die a free person. Okay? That's important to be free. I don't want to. But that's not sufficient. We've got to challenge this whole notion of what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. The 1,000 bases in 130 countries. the invasions, the occupations, the sanctions, the embargoes, the kidnappings, the renditions, the torture. Got to challenge that whole paradigm that came into existence because of the Cold War, and somehow or another we have permitted it to be extended. Because that's the root of the problem. And everybody knows. You've been out, if you've been out pulling weeds out in the field or in a yard, you know that you can't just cut the branches of that weed. You got to pull it out by its root. And so we've got to defend these freedoms, but we've got to get rid of the cause of the anger and hatred that then is used as the excuse. And when they tell you that this is permanent, that this is part of your life, this warfare state nonsense, they're leading this country into bankruptcy, as we all know. They've put our nation into hock to the Chinese communist regime. And they tell you that this is permanent nonsense, or that it's going to last several generations. Nothing's permanent, especially not tyranny. That if you get together with people in my generation, the generations in between, the generations that are older than mine, and those of us that value freedom, we get together, we can change things. We stick with ideas, we stick with ideals, we stick with principles. We can change the world. And that's what this conference is all about. Thank you very much.